Well, let's go to Jay. He's in Colorado. Jay Noon is with us. Hello, Jay.
Actually in Keensburg, Colorado, believe it or not.
All right.
And anyways, I was listening to a radio station out here. I'm going to change the subject a little bit. And they were talking about, they got a really good AM liberty-oriented radio station out here. I actually emailed them the other night, told them about Free Talk Live and gave them your contact information.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So anyways, they had this show on called Free America or something like that, or To Free America. And they were talking about 501c3 corporations and how these churches are literally, being controlled by the IRS. And the 501c3, there was a thing called the Johnson Act, named after Senator Johnson, who then became a president. And anyways, what it was is it prohibited 501c3 corporations, and I'm not sure if this is specific to a church, but they were just saying 501c3s, from having political, speech. And since the Free State Project, from what I understand, is now a 501c3 nonprofit corporation,
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question to ponder, I'm not expecting you guys to answer it, but the listeners is, what's this going to do for, obviously, everything is political.
Well, I think that the Free State Project has a way around that, but also you bring up a larger question of the churches and that the free church movements we're talking about. We've got Jay Noon on the line, calling from Colorado, of all places. Normally he's in Massachusetts. Jay, you're out there and you were listening to a discussion on some other radio show about 501c3, this IRS tax designation that many companies, or not companies, but charities and churches seek. In the case of the Free State Project, they have recently been given this 501c3 designation. And your concern is that that will somehow prevent them from taking political positions. Is that right, Jay?
Well, I'm not worried about that. My concern is that they engage in this, multi-page contract with the IRS now. From what I am understanding, this Johnson Act is one of these, would maybe be one of these contractual caveats that they're not supposed to be engaging in, political discussion.
Well, the good news is the Free State Project doesn't do that. And any time you bring up, hey, why don't you Free Staters do this and this? Well, then the Free State Project's answer is always, well, the Free State Project doesn't do any of those things. They don't take positions on issues. They don't advocate. They don't do any advocacy on issues one way or another. All they do, the purpose of the Free State Project is to basically advertise the idea of liberty-loving people moving to New Hampshire.
So I've pulled up some information about 501c3s.
Okay.
Any nonprofit that fits one or more of the following: a community chest, a fund, a cooperating association or foundation organized and operated for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, or educational purposes, can qualify as 501c3. Now, all 501c3 entities are prohibited from directly supporting or opposing any specific political candidate.
Mm-hmm.
They can do some level of lobbying, but that cannot be the bulk of their expenses.
I don't think you're going to see the Free State Project do either of those things, any
Right.
lobbying or supporting of political
So,
candidates.
A 501c3, as I am understanding this, they can put out literature that mentions a topic and takes a position. They just can't do it in a manner that supports or opposes any specific candidates.
You follow that, Jay?
I do. And another thing these guys are talking about, which, would apply with the Shire Free Church and the Church of the Sword, is they were talking about that churches are automatically exempt from all this taxation, and they were getting into this a little bit on the show, and they were talking about 501c3 is not necessary, but what is happening with a lot of these churches is they're now being threatened that if they don't preach certain things, that they're going to lose their 501c3 status. And what the guy on the radio was really getting to, so who is the church serving? God or
the state
money or the IRS?
It's a real concern, and there's a whole movement out there in the world of churches called the Free Church Movement. There are churches who are trying to untether themselves from the IRS, because what you say is correct, at least based on my research. And Daryl, you and I were involved in doing some of this research.
Right, and I've been doing some research on this for several years, and I'm actually the one that pointed you in some of the direction.
The Free Church. When we were looking at forming the Shire Free Church here in New Hampshire, that was something that was really interesting to me, was that it's true, you don't need 501c3 status to accept donations that are tax deductible from people. But that's what every lawyer will tell a church.
Right.
So if a church, if the church wants to take donations from people and they want them to be tax deductible, there's this idea out there that they have to be 501c3. That's false. It's just not. It's just not true from my understanding of the IRS rules.
And we've actually read the IRS regulate, or at least I have.
Yep.
I've read IRS publications, and they plainly say any of these entities are automatically tax exempt,
right,
and are not required to file for 501c3 status.
So all 501.
However, doing so gives you this certification that then allows banks to do something.
I don't think it does anything for a church. I think that it hurts churches because, as you're pointing out,
of course,
Jay, it results in them being controlled. It results in the IRS being able to tell a pastor, for instance, you can't endorse a political candidate. So if a church pastor feels very strongly about politics and wants to get up on, this is sort of the classic example of how 501c3 has resulted in churches being controlled, is they'll go after pastors who make a statement publicly about their beliefs and what they think their parishioners or whoever should vote for. That's a violation of the rules of the 501c3. But had they not
only if the preacher does it from behind the pulpit. If he steps out from behind the pulpit and says, I'm speaking to you as John Smith, not as Pastor John Smith.
I see.
He can say whatever he wants to.
Right. So not just behind the pulpit, but if it were published in like the church newsletter or something like that.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's a bad thing. And Jay, thanks for bringing that to the forefront tonight. Appreciate that. It's definitely something that I think a lot of people who are in churches should be concerned with, because essentially what happens is the church, they form their church, and they're all under this mistaken impression that they have to have 501c3 or else no one will be able to tax deduct their donations to the church. It's not true. That's what the lawyers will tell you. That's because the lawyer wants to charge you $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever the hell they charge to hold your hand through the 501c3 application process.
And then just filing the application to the IRS is somewhere between $400 and $800.
It took, I think, 2.5 years for the Free State Project to make theirs work. And they finally have just recently gotten it. Now, with the Free State Project, they may need to do it because they're not a church. They're some sort of advocacy group or whatever.
And I'm actually surprised that they did not go for 501c4.
What's the difference?
C4 allows for a little bit more leeway and flexibility in being able to take positions on things.
Okay.
So, for instance, Downsize DC, which is an organization that I know you're familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
I believe they do some level of advertising on the Liberty Radio Network. They have both a 501c3 and a 501c4. So the C4 has a little extra leeway in lobbying and advocacy, whereas the 501c3 is specifically for educational.
So there you go. If you can form a church and you can accept donations from people, as I understand it, and those can be tax deductible even without a 501c3. So no reason to do that. More coming up. We continue here. We were talking about 501c3. Doesn't sound like a real interesting topic. Who really wants to talk about IRS codes and numbers and rules? I personally don't. I'm not interested in the IRS. I don't want to do any business with the IRS. I want nothing to do with those people. But some organizations feel like they need to seek this 501c3 status, that it's very important, that there are people out there with money who would give it to the organization in question, but they won't because the organization isn't a 501c3, and therefore the person supposedly cannot deduct that donation from their taxes.
Right.
So that's the reason why, for instance, the Free State Project just recently acquired this 501c3. They had not been up until just recently, like within the last month, I believe. And so in theory now, they should be able to get more donations to the organization as a result of that. So I understand the motivation there. But when it comes to churches, there's just a lot of misinformation out there that essentially churches have been misled by the lawyer industrial complex. These lawyers out there will tell every time a church comes knocking and asking, their answer is, well, yeah, of course you need a 501c3. Here, give me a $5,000 retainer and we'll get the paperwork started for you. Or I don't know what the amount of the money is that the lawyers charge for this, but I don't imagine it's cheap because it seems like it's been an involved process for the Free State Project, a 2.5-year long hassle just to acquire this this designation.
Yeah, and I had seen a statistic, I think it was like 15 or 20 years ago, where the average approval process on a 501c3 was just a matter of months, like 3 to 4 months, and now it's 2 to 3 years.
It's ridiculous. So when it comes to the churches, you can do your own research on this. This is what I learned when I was looking into it. Daryl, you also looked into this as well when we were forming the Shire Free Church. What I learned is that IRS says that you can do tax-deductible donations to churches who are not 501c3.
Yes.
So therefore, the 501c3 process for a church is a complete waste of time. Not only is it a waste of time, it's counterproductive because, as was pointed out by Jay earlier, if you acquire that status, you're then restricted as a church from giving people ideas about how to vote and on issues and on candidates and things like that. It restricts the church's freedom of speech in return for nothing. In return for no benefit whatsoever. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, if there's some great benefit to being a 501c3 as a church, I'd really love to know what it is. Let me know at 855-450-FREE, but from what I can tell, it's only a harm to a church to become a 501c3.
It probably makes the approval of local property tax exemptions a little easier.
Maybe.
But there's one of the 3 churches here in New Hampshire that was denied that I believe is a 501c3.
Is that right? Which one is that?
I
Peaceful
think
Assembly?
the Peaceful Assembly is.
That's interesting.
Or their filing of the appeal makes it seem as though they are.
So what you're referencing is there's 3 churches. All 3 of them are basically activist churches,
right?
That have been denied. Shire Free Church, Peaceful Assembly Church, and Church of the Sword. All 3 have been denied in tax exemption filings this year, and they're all 3 appealing at the Superior Court level as those cases move ahead. We'll tell you more about those because to me it's a real pure freedom of religion issue. Basically, the tax assessors are saying we don't think you're a church, and or that we're not going to give you this exemption because we don't recognize you as a church. And that's
I would love to see a Pastafarian church in Keene apply for the exemption just to see what the tax board says to them.
Go for it, man. I think it's a great idea. I don't know who would form that church, but
I don't know, but there have been Pastafarians around the world who, to varying degrees, have been recognized as having a legitimate religion by various governments. I think it was some guy in Germany that wanted to wear a strainer on his or a colander on his head in his driver's license photo. And they initially said no, and so he filed an appeal and said, I'm a Pastafarian, it's part of my religion. And then the court said, okay.
It's a shame that that's what you have to do, but that's what if you're trying to exert your freedom of religion in this country and apparently around the world, they're just going to deny it until you fight for it. And it's the whole idea of freedom of religion, just like freedom of speech and right to bear arms, all of it. The whole idea is ridiculous. It means nothing. The government guys just ignore their own rules. They ignore their constitution. Every provision has been broken and ignored, and it's just so sad. It really is. It's frustrating.
Free Talk Live, 7 nights a week from 7 to 10 Eastern, live on the Liberty Radio Network at LRN.FM.